Okay, so this is a slide that I added. We didn't have this in class, so you don't need to worry about it as far as test purposes for right now. But I just wanted to point out a couple of points with the functional unit of the kidney, which is called the nephron. Okay, so the nephron has two main parts. Okay? It has the glomerulus, which is this up here, this little bundle of capillaries, and then all of this up to this point, which is called the renal tubule. Okay. Now, the glomerulus, which is this again, this is just a little bundle of capillaries, is fed by what's called the afferent arteriole. And this afferent arteriole feeds blood into this glomerulus, and that pushes fluid out into this first part of the renal tubule called Bowman's capsule. Okay, so this is Bowman's capsule. So it captures this fluid that's pushed out from the blood. Okay, on the other end of the glomerulus, you have what's called the efferent arteriole. Okay, and this is going to form what are known as the peritubular capillaries. Okay, and these will be for absorbing things like water and sodium and things like that. Okay, so Bowman's capsule captures that filtrate, and then it goes into the first part of the renal tubule called the proximal convoluted tubule, and this is where the body will basically reabsorb things like water and sodium, also glucose and amino acids. After the proximal convoluted tubule, we have the loop of Henle, and here we have water absorption, reabsorption, sodium absorption, chloride absorption, bicarbonate absorption, a number of things. Okay. Now, after the loop of Henle, we have the distal convoluted tubule, and this is where drugs and things like that will be secreted into the urine, but also hydrogens and potassiums. Okay, and then finally we have this structure, which is called the collecting duct. And the collecting duct isn't a part of the nephron, and that's because multiple nephrons will actually feed into the collecting duct. But the important part here is this is where antidiuretic hormone has a lot of its effect. Okay, and stimulates the reabsorption of water into the blood. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out to try to give you a bigger picture of kind of what's going on in the kidney. We will talk about this again when we get into renal pathophysiology. Okay, so tonicity, we reviewed this in class. If you have an isotonic alteration or an isotonic solution, that means the concentration of stuff outside of the cell is the same as the concentration inside. Therefore, you have no net movement of water. Okay? In a hypertonic alteration, the concentration outside the cell is greater than the concentration inside the cell. Therefore, water is going to move out and the cell will shrink. And in a hypotonic alteration, the concentration is greater on the inside of the cell than the outside, so water moves in. Okay, then we talked about altered fluid balance, starting with hypovolemia. So this is just low fluid volume. Can be due to hemorrhage or excessive sweating, not drinking enough water, or if you have a shift of fluid to a third space, which occurs in edema. Clinical manifestations, things like thirst and decreased urine output, dry mucous membranes, drops in blood pressure, and with that, increases in heart rate. So dehydration, this is when you have decreased extracellular fluid volume or increased sodium in relation to water. Okay, so cause of this, obviously things like diarrhea, sweating, vomiting, hyperventilation, because when you exhale water, or just not drinking enough water. Water intoxication, most commonly caused by drinking too much water after strenuous exercise, but also the use of diuretics can result in this. Okay, then we talked about edema. So this is excessive accumulation of fluid in the interstitial space. So that's an important part. This is fluid that's accumulating in the interstitial space, not inside the cells. Now, this can be due to a number of factors, one being capillary hydrostatic pressure increases or decreases in capillary oncotic pressure, obstruction of the lymphatics, that's called lymphedema, or increased capillary permeability, which we see in inflammation. So capillary hydrostatic pressure, increases oftentimes due to increased venous pressure. So if you have increased venous pressure, which occurs in things like DVT or cirrhosis or standing, that increases capillary hydrostatic pressure. And I'll explain that more when I talk about cirrhosis. Or if you're retaining salt, that's going to result in water retention also, which increases blood volume, and that's going to increase your capillary hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so these are all associated with salt and water retention. We will talk about these. We'll talk about liver disease today, but we'll talk about CHF and renal failure down the road. Now, liver disease results in decreased albumin production because albumin is produced by the liver. The liver is really important for increasing capillary oncotic pressure, so if it's not there, this perpetuates edema. Any loss of plasma proteins will decrease oncotic pressure and be a factor in the formation of edema. Like I said, increased capillary permeability occurs in inflammation. And then lymphedema, this is caused by damage or removal of lymphatic vessels. So this could be due to, things like tumors or radiation or removal. I use the example of a unilateral mastectomy. You can really see lymphedema in those cases. So the clinical manifestations of edema, generalized or localized swelling, dependent edema, you see this in areas that are susceptible to gravity, depending on your position. So obviously the legs and feet if you are upright, or like the sacral area if you are supine. Pitting edema, you see this more so with diseases of vital organs. Non-pitting edema, this is, lymphedema, myxedema. And those aren't always, the case, but just in general. And then treatment, elevation, compression. If it's really, really severe, administer albumin, and obviously treatment of any underlying causes. So, edema. So here are the forces that kind of cause edema to happen. So if you increase hydrostatic pressure, so you increase venous pressure, this causes fluid to move out into the interstitial space. If you have decreased oncotic pressure, you don't have enough stuff pulling that fluid back in, so it just hangs out in the interstitial space. Increased permeability, again, this occurs in cases of inflammation. We know that edema is a cardinal sign of inflammation. And also lymphatic obstruction. So in this case, it's a tumor obstructing the lymphatics. All of that excess fluid cannot be picked up by the lymphatic system. Okay, so then we talked about cirrhosis. So this is a chronic liver disease, and basically what happens here is you replace the functional tissue of the liver, parenchyma is the functional tissue, the hepatocytes, with scar tissue, and that really interferes with blood flow. Okay, most common causes, chronic alcoholism and hepatitis C, but also things like heart failure, specifically right-sided heart failure because of the congestion in the venous system, but also obstruction of the bile duct. So this scar tissue is laid down by these cells called stellate cells, which are basically fibroblasts. They just make fibers. But the big problem is the obstruction of blood flow, which just continues to decrease the function of the liver. So clinical manifestations, abdominal pain, loss of appetite. You'll see jaundice, easy bruising, GI upset, a number of things. Now, a late manifestation is ascites, okay, along with compromised organs of basically every other system. And I will show on a couple slides how ascites actually forms, okay? So diagnosis, liver biopsy is confirmative. Imaging, CT scans, MRI, and blood testing to check liver function. So as far as treatment, diuretics, paracentesis to try to remove fluid, shunts to divert blood from the portal vein, which I'll show why that's important in a second, and also nutritional supplementation because they're quite compromised nutritionally. So again, cirrhosis. This is just showing paracentesis. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can go ventrally, you can go laterally. But anyway, I want to just kind of demonstrate how ascites happens. So ascites, of course, is the edema of the abdominal cavity. So this is the liver. The big vein that goes into the liver is called the portal vein. And the portal vein will accept all of these other veins. Okay. And these are the veins that are coming from the digestive organs. Okay. And, further down in the actual organs, we have the capillary beds. So with all of this scar tissue up here, all of this blood just keeps backing up and backing up and backing up, and it backs up into capillaries that would be down here. So when that happens, that increases capillary hydrostatic pressure. So that pushes fluid out into this space here. All right. Now, on top of that, the liver is also not producing albumin. So if you're not producing albumin, you will have decreased capillary oncotic pressure, so you don't have forces keeping fluid in the capillaries. So it's kind of a double whammy. Not only do you have increased capillary hydrostatic pressure, but also decreased capillary oncotic pressure. And those are two big drivers for edema, and in this case, ascites. Okay, so then we talked about electrolytes, basically things that when you dissolve them in water, they conduct electricity. Sodium is the most abundant cation in the body, and of course we find this in high concentration in the extracellular fluid outside of the cell. Chloride is also found in highest concentration outside of the cell, and it's the most abundant negative ion, or anion, and that's because it just moves passively with sodium. So this is just showing, where these major ions are located. So sodium, of course, high concentration outside the cell. Potassium, high concentration inside the cell. Chloride, high concentration outside. Calcium, high concentration outside. Bicarb, high concentration outside. So you can see how some of these are organized. Alright, then we talked about hyponatremia, which is when you have low levels of sodium, specifically less than 135 milliequivalents per liter, and that's in the blood. And this can be due to an increase of water, which we'll talk about how that can happen later in the class, but also a decrease in sodium. So common causes: sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, and basically when you lose that extra sodium outside of the cell, water is going to move into the cell, okay, and the cells will swell up. So clinical manifestations, some important ones here: hypotension because of the loss of blood volume, tachycardia, oliguria. Those are pretty important clinical manifestations, but you definitely will see nausea, vomiting, lethargy, confusion as it worsens. So again, this is showing hyponatremia, which is a hypotonic alteration. You have less sodium out here, so water is going to move into the cell, and the cells will swell. Okay, so hypernatremia, this is when you have too high of sodium, greater than 145 milliequivalents per liter in the blood. And this usually results in hyperchloremia because we know that chloride tends to move passively with sodium. Okay, and this can be due to an increase in sodium or decrease of water. So if you consume too much sodium in the diet, that's a common cause. There are certainly other causes, but water is going to move to the extracellular space, and this dehydrates cells. So this is a hypertonic alteration. So important clinical manifestations here: thirst, weight gain, increased blood pressure, bounding pulse. Again, the weight gain is due to the fluid. You're holding on to fluid in the blood, and increased blood pressure because of the increased volume. So again, this is hypernatremia. This is a hypertonic alteration. So you have a higher concentration of sodium out here. Water moves out to try to dilute it. So conditions associated with hypernatremia, we are going to talk about these specifically when we come to them, and we will bring this back up. So don't worry about this too much now. Just know that these topics are going to apply as we learn about more and more diseases. But I want to point out that tachypnea, increased respiratory rate, can cause hypernatremia because of the loss of water. And then again, conditions associated with hyponatremia. So SIADH, we'll talk about that specifically, and basically this causes a type of hyponatremia known as dilutional hyponatremia. Hypothyroidism, CHF, liver cirrhosis, which we talked about, all associated with hyponatremia. Okay, so potassium, the most abundant intracellular cation, very, very important. Also important to note is that changes in pH affect potassium levels. So basically, if somebody is acidotic, okay, we'll say this is a cell, somebody's in acidosis, what happens is acid, H+, think of it as H+, moves into the cell. All right, we know that potassium is in high concentration in the cell. So when you have more positives coming in, potassium leaves. Okay, so potassium is going to leave in order to maintain electroneutrality, maintain balance. Okay, so that's an important point. And basically that can cause hyperkalemia. Now, let's talk about hypokalemia really quickly. So this is when concentrations of potassium in the blood are less than 3.5 milliequivalents per liter. You see this with vomiting, diarrhea, also diuretics, pretty common causes. So hyperkalemia, serum levels greater than 5.5 milliequivalents per liter. Actually pretty rare because the kidneys are very good at secreting potassium into the urine. So if this happens, it's typically due to mismanagement of medications. Now, like I just said, movement of potassium from the intracellular to the extracellular space can cause hyperkalemia. So again, that's just the acidosis case. So if somebody is in acidosis and you have the movement of these hydrogen ions to the inside of the cell, potassium will move out to maintain what in the world? To maintain electroneutrality. Let me fix that. So potassium is going to move out, and again that will cause hyperkalemia. And that also has effects on chloride and bicarb also. Okay, so calcium. Calcium is controlled mostly by parathyroid hormone, which comes from the parathyroid glands, but also vitamin D. Vitamin D is very important. And basically the job of both parathyroid hormone and vitamin D is to increase the amount of calcium in the blood, increase serum calcium levels. Calcitonin's job is actually to take calcium from the blood and put it back into the bones, but it's really not that important of a hormone. Now, calcium, we need it for our bones and our teeth, but we also need it to communicate between neurons. We need it to clot our blood. We need it for smooth muscle contractions. We need it for skeletal muscle contractions. Calcium is very important, okay? And it's kept in very, very low concentrations inside the cell. Outside the cell, or in the blood, we find it between 8.5 and 10.5 milligrams per deciliter. Hypocalcemia, neuromuscular excitability. So I talked about Trousseau's and things like that. It causes neuromuscular excitability, and that's because calcium actually increases the gap between resting potential and threshold. I will talk about that more when we talk about the nervous system. Okay, so neuromuscular excitability, tetany, which is basically involuntary muscle contraction, sometimes to the point of paralysis. And cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest can occur in both hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia. Okay. Causes of hypocalcemia. Things like hypoparathyroidism. So if you don't produce enough parathyroid hormone, you can expect hypocalcemia. Also, insufficient intake or maybe a lack of vitamin D. If you don't have enough vitamin D, you're not absorbing calcium in the gut. So those are just a couple of more common causes. Hypercalcemia, nausea, constipation, and nephrolithiasis. So definitely constipation, definitely nephrolithiasis. Dysrhythmias, bradycardia, cardiac arrest, definitely associated with cardiovascular issues. Causes of hypercalcemia, things like hyperparathyroidism. So if you produce too much parathyroid hormone, that can certainly cause hypercalcemia. Also, too much vitamin D. So if you have an excess of vitamin D, that can cause hypercalcemia. Vitamin D is believed to be the most toxic of the vitamins. Okay. So those are just a couple of causes. So magnesium, very important cation, especially in the cell, but serum value 1.8 to 3 milliequivalents per liter. Its main, I don't want to say its main job, but one of its most important jobs is to be a cofactor for energy producing and energy using reactions, which are pretty much all of them. Magnesium is very important for reactions that use ATP. Now, magnesium increases neuromuscular excitability. That's an important point, and you'll see that when we talk about hypermagnesemia. So, hypomagnesemia, muscle cramping, irritability, hypotension is common, but muscle cramping is definitely one to remember. So, causes of magnesemia, these would be things like malabsorption, so you're not absorbing the magnesium, and a couple of others. Okay. Now, hypermagnesemia, results in excess nerve function. So you'll see things like overstimulation of muscles to the point where they're weak. You'll see things like diarrhea and causes of hypermagnesemia. Things like renal failure is a pretty common cause. You see it a lot with renal failure. Okay. Also, sometimes people will consume too many antacids that contain magnesium, or they oversupplement just magnesium by itself, and that can certainly result in hypermagnesemia. Okay, then we talked about acid-base balance. We know acid-base balance is tightly regulated. pH stays between 7.35 to 7.45, and we're able to keep it there because of buffer systems. Okay, so buffer systems are just these systems that resist changes in pH. And they do that because they're typically a mixture of a weak acid and a weak base. Okay, and I'll kind of show that in a little bit how that works and why that's important. So our first line of defense when it comes to buffering is phosphate and proteins. These are negatively charged. We find them outside the cell, but also inside the cell, so they're really important interests. They're probably the most important buffer system inside cells. Okay, and the reason is since they're negatively charged. Okay, so for example, phosphate, PO4-, since it's negatively charged, if you have an influx of, H+ ions, which you would see in acidosis, into the cell, this can kind of suck it up, okay, and can kind of neutralize this. So that's why it's such an important intracellular buffer. Proteins really do the same thing. Okay, so probably the major buffer system in the body is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And this includes both functions in the lungs and the kidneys. So the lungs are really the second line of defense because they can change how much carbonic acid is being kept in the body or being excreted from the body through respiration. Okay, so if you blow off more CO2, pH is going to go up. You're blowing off acid. If you have deep, slow respirations, you're going to or just slow respiration, you're going to keep more CO2. pH will go down. Now the kidneys are very important because they can do a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, they can reabsorb bicarbonate, which is a base. They can make new bicarbonate with water and CO2. They can secrete hydrogen ions, acid. So they can do a lot of things. Kidneys are very important. They're the third line of defense. Now at normal pH, 7.4, there's a 20-to-1 ratio of bicarb to CO2, or bicarb to carbonic acid. Okay, CO2, really its acidic form is carbonic acid. Okay, and then compensation, this occurs through either respiratory changes or urine changes. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is just showing that at normal pH, 7.4, 20 parts bicarb to 1 part carbonic acid. So a couple other ones here. Proteins, like I said, proteins are negatively charged, so they can attract those H+ ions. Really important. So they're kind of just like a passive buffer. They're just there, and they can buffer very well. So for example, hemoglobin can act as a weak base, and then it can bind with H+, make it a weak acid, so it can kind of go both ways. And can also bind CO2, which, think of that as an acid. And like I said, the kidneys are very important because they can secrete hydrogens, they can reabsorb bicarb, they can make new bicarb, they can excrete bicarb, they can do it all. Now down here, would secreting H+ ions into the urine increase or decrease pH? So if you are secreting H+ ions in the urine, okay, you're acidifying the urine, that's going to cause pH to go up. It's going to alkalize the pH. So we're going to talk about this system in more detail when we talk about the respiratory system, but I just want to go through it really quickly right now. Okay, you don't need to worry about these details, but I just want to kind of paint the picture. So in our tissues, our cells produce CO2. Okay, CO2. CO2 enters the blood. All right, some of it's dissolved in plasma, some of it is bound to hemoglobin, but 70% of it will actually enter red blood cells and undergo this reaction that, along with water, will form carbonic acid and bicarb. Bicarb, remember buffer systems, weak acids and weak bases. Bicarb is the weak base, carbonic acid is the weak acid. And that's what makes them so good, because HCO3- say you have you have some acid, H plus. Bicarb can kind of neutralize that, okay, and it will actually become H2CO3. Now, the same thing with H2CO3, carbonic acid. If the body is, alkalizing, if it's becoming more basic, H2CO3, carbonic acid, can get rid of these hydrogen ions, and then it will become bicarb. So that's how a buffer system works, okay? Really important buffer system. There's some other things that are going on that we'll talk about later, but basically, once this gets back to the lungs, once this red blood cell, this reaction actually reverses, CO2 is released from that red blood cell, and you exhale it. Okay? So really important buffer system. Don't worry about the details now because we're going to learn the details later. Okay, so acid-base imbalances, you obtain these values through ABGs, and acidosis, this is just when pH drops below 7.35. And this is either due to a decrease in bicarb or an increase in acid or hydrogen ion concentration. Alkalosis, this is when pH is above 7.45, and it may be due to an increase in bicarb or a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. And of course, these can be either metabolic or respiratory. So metabolic acidosis, due to an increase in non-carbonic acids. That's really key, non-carbonic acids. We're not talking about the lungs, we're talking about a metabolic acidosis. Or a loss of bicarb, as well as the possible inability for the kidneys to make new bicarb. Okay, which can happen in renal failure. So lactic acidosis, diabetic ketoacidosis, those are a couple of really common causes. We'll talk about diabetic ketoacidosis in detail when we get to the endocrine system. Lactic acidosis can arise by a number of different conditions and situations. Metabolic alkalosis, typically due to the loss of metabolic acids, okay, and then you have an increase in bicarb. So an example here, hyperaldosteronism, results in the retention of sodium bicarbonate. Okay, so if you retain bicarbonate, obviously that's a base, pH will go up, as well as diuretic use can cause metabolic alkalosis. Okay. Even vomiting sometimes when you lose that stomach acid can result in metabolic alkalosis as well. Okay, respiratory acidosis. This is typically due to hypoventilation, some sort of depression of respiration. So maybe damage to the medulla and the brainstem, or maybe something like the restrictive lung diseases like emphysema and pneumonia. Well, not pneumonia, but emphysema, asthma. But pneumonia can certainly cause respiratory acidosis. Pulmonary edema, which you see in left-sided heart failure. So yeah, basically just depression of respiration in some way. Anything that allows CO2 to stay in the body, okay, is going to cause respiratory acidosis, okay, from the lungs. Now, respiratory alkalosis, this is typically due to deep, rapid respiration or hyperventilation. You see this in sepsis and CHF and cirrhosis, but basically you're blowing off too much CO2, and that's going to cause pH to go up. Now, this term hypercapnia, that refers to too much CO2 in the blood. Hypocapnia, too little CO2 in the blood. So I just want to point out those terms. Okay, so this is kind of a flow chart showing all the things we talked about. Acidemia, this just refers to acids in the blood. It doesn't say anything about whether or not acidosis. It just is, saying that there are acids in the blood. Same thing with alkalemia. Once you get to acidosis, that's when you drop below 7.35. And same thing with alkalosis, that's when you get above 7.45. Now, I do want to point this out. When somebody has a respiratory problem, whether it's acidosis or alkalosis, you compensate with the kidneys. If you have a metabolic problem, you compensate with the lungs. Again, respiratory problem, you compensate with the kidneys. Metabolic problem, compensate with the lungs. That's why people who have diabetic ketoacidosis, a type of metabolic acidosis, that's why they hyperventilate. Okay, they have those characteristic respirations because they're trying to blow off acid. Okay, you're compensating with the lungs. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.